Hello, Matthew Bell with Alzheimer'sProof.com, and today I wanted to talk through a news item that's recently crossed my desk, and it has to do with the idea of beta-amyloid protein aggregation in the brain and its relationship to cognitive impairment. Now, this is going to butt up against the conversation about cause. I've gotten into this in other places. I have a video so far, just one video that is dedicated to explicating the various different candidates for causes for Alzheimer's disease. There really isn't a clear contender for number one in that regard. There are a number of ones that are kind of thrown around. Some of them are a little bit stronger than others, and some of them you're going to read about more in depth if you get into this kind of literature. But in the video, I cover a number of things, so I don't want to repeat them here. But some of the candidate causes include oxidation, chronic inflammation. They include things like acetylcholine deficiency, which I've gotten into in a separate video, even apart from cause. But one of the theories that comes up perennially, or I should say there's a pair of theories that really comes up perennially, and they have to do with different protein aggregates that collect inside of the brain, essentially just protein gunk that just builds up in the brain. And these are referred to as plaques and tangles. Specifically, beta-amyloid plaques and tau protein neurofibrillary tangles. So these two hypotheses I kind of conflate in the causal video because I talk about just plaques and tangles because it's common to read about this. But in fact, there are people who are beta-amyloidists and people who are tauists who think that they're really different hypotheses for the actual causal relation that's involved here. So to briefly rehearse it, on the beta-amyloid theory, the protein deposit, beta-amyloid, sort of goes haywire and starts to collect a bunch of junk in between the neuronal cells. So in between the nerve cells in the area that's usually referred to as the synaptic gap or the synapses, there's an aggregation of protein, and that this protein aggregation essentially disrupts the function of communication between the nerve cells. And that nerve cell disruption is going to then result, once it gets to a critical level, will actually start to cause cognitive impairment. Now, one of the reasons people think, well, it doesn't cause cognitive impairment right out of the gate is because the brain has redundant structures in place so that it can kind of, if there's a roadblock in the synaptic transfer between two nerve cells, the brain can compensate. But once that roadblock becomes systemic, wide enough, the brain has trouble catching up or even compensating at all, and this is going to result in memory loss and different reasoning effects and so on. So on the beta-amyloid view, the aggregation of the proteins in the brain comes first, and cognitive impairment comes after that. It comes as a result of that. So the beta-amyloid aggregation is the cause of some future cognitive impairment. But recently there's been a number of articles that have highlighted a study in which it was found that there are people who do not have the telltale aggregation or the expected aggregation of amyloid, and yet they have cognitive impairment. So this group of people has turned that kind of causal relationship essentially on its head, because it looks like there is a non-negligible subgroup of people for whom cognitive impairment precedes the amyloid aggregation. Now, what these studies found was that the beta-amyloid protein does eventually build up in these people. So they followed them, I think it was over the course of 4 years, and they determined that indeed after the study, and the study lasted, I suppose, for this entire period of time, they found that after there was a baseline cognitive reading that was taken, these people did develop amyloid protein deposits, but that it took place after they had already started to score in various different memory and cognitive tests. They had scored as if they were starting to suffer from cognitive impairment. So in other words, the suggestion is that the cognitive impairment preceded the development or the aggregation of beta-amyloid. Now there's a number of things here, and I'm going to I'll put a couple of these articles up on the screen so you can actually see, and we'll talk through one at greater length. But the first thing to realize here is that, again, there's no definitive cause. There's no consensus as to what the cause of Alzheimer's disease is. And the prominent amyloid hypothesis is often juxtaposed with a tau hypothesis. So you have people who are amyloidists and people who are tauists, and the people who are tauists, tau is another protein, and in this case, this protein causes the neuron cells inside the brain to be basically overrun with this tau protein. On the tau hypothesis, there starts to become these neurofibrillary tangles inside of the neuron cells themselves. So rather than the amyloid, which collects between the nerve cells, on the tau hypothesis, it actually forms inside of the nerve cells themselves. Now, tau is sometimes found in patients who have mild cognitive impairment, but they do not have the pathology that is specific to the beta-amyloid deposits that collect in other patients. And we start to veer off into other directions with respect to some of the causal hypotheses. So, for example, the ApoE4, the ApoE4 variant gene that I've talked about in other videos, and I just did a video where I tested for this myself through 23andMe, and in some hypotheses, this ApoE4 variant may control things like the beta-amyloid aggregation, or it may control tau. They don't really know. Another thing that factors in is going to be inflammation. There are things in the brain called microglia. There's something called an astrocyte, and these things typically are able to clear away the protein junk that collects, but in an Alzheimer's brain, they don't perform the function that they're supposed to, and it's unknown why. One of the things that should be appreciated about this research is just how difficult some of these judgments are to make. And what I mean by that is, so in order to judge whether the beta amyloid comes first, what they essentially had to do is make a determination as to what the beta amyloid deposit level looks like in a normal brain. Because it turns out that just as a normal part of aging, that anybody's brain might have a certain degree of these beta amyloid deposits. And so they have a brain where they think, okay, here's definitely a person who's got Alzheimer's disease. What is the level of beta amyloid? What does it look like in that brain? And then they take a person who otherwise looks normal and they say essentially, what is the level of beta amyloid deposit in that brain? And what they did basically then was they started to ask those people who looked like they had normal amyloid deposits, they started to give them cognitive tests. And what they determined was that in some of these cognitive tests, people started to perform poorly. So in other words, they had a group of people whose amyloid deposits looked normal, and yet they were scoring in such a way as suggested to the researchers that they were starting to suffer from some kind of a mild cognitive impairment. Now, one of the takeaways then that the researchers will mention, and I will look at it here in just a moment, is the fact that there are certain tests that are very rough, and they are only able to detect cognitive impairment when it's pretty obvious. So, for instance, a clock face test, for instance, if a person can't arrange the clock face correctly, pretty obvious that there's some kind of a cognitive impairment going on, or if they don't know who the president is, pretty obvious that there's something going on. Not sure what day of the week is, again. But then there are certain things that might not be so obvious. And so one of the takeaways from the research is that testing has to get a little bit finer grained. It has to be better at detecting cognitive impairment. Because one of the concerns is essentially that we might not have the tests available, cognitive tests, to be able to indicate whether a person is suffering from cognitive impairment. And so since the assumption has been that the amyloid precedes the cognitive impairment, there hasn't really been a good cognitive test, so some of these researchers worry. Because in many cases, Alzheimer's, of course, becomes apparent when there are certain obvious behavioral symptoms. And so those symptoms can include things like confusion, language impoverishment, memory loss, misplacing things, poor judgment, problem solving, that can be either with planning or reasoning, visual spatial problems. They might withdraw socially. The Alzheimer's Association has an excellent list of these in terms of they have an article on the 10 early signs and symptoms of Alzheimer's disease. And in many cases, it is these behavioral symptoms that are going to be the first indication. And so you've got to appreciate the fact that it's somewhat difficult for researchers to get a handle on these questions because cognitive impairment in early stages can kind of go up and down. A person can have lucid periods and periods where they have much more difficulty actually processing questions and information. There seemed to be a flurry of these articles around the first of the year and the close of 2019, beginning of 2020. So you can see this one dated January the 6th from Medscape and the article title is Amyloid Accumulation Doesn't Always Precede Cognitive Decline. Connected article January the 6th, also 2020, from Columbia Research Center in the Columbia University in the city of New York. The article title here again, Amyloid Accumulation Doesn't Always Precede Cognitive Decline. And then the article I'm going to focus on from a website called MedPage Today, Do Amyloid Plaques and Alzheimer's Always Come First? And then the subtitle, Sensitive Measures Identify a Subgroup with Subtle Cognitive Difficulties but Normal Amyloid. And that was dated December the 30th of 2019, week before the other articles. And here's the upshot. There was a group of individuals whose, you see here, baseline amyloid levels were statistically similar to cognitively normal people, but yet they showed objectively defined subtle cognitive deficits at baseline. Really dense here, but the idea is you take a group whose amyloid levels do not seem to be out of control. They don't seem to have extensive amyloid deposits in their brain, and yet they have cognitive deficits. But notice the word subtle. They have subtle cognitive deficits. So this wasn't a dramatic finding. And the very next, or the continuation of it says, an increasing brain amyloid deposition on PET imaging over 4 years. So in other words, these people had subtle cognitive deficits, normal amyloid deposits, not anything like what they would expect a person with full-blown Alzheimer's to have, and yet they had subtle cognitive deficits, and then they developed more extensive amyloid deposition over the course of 4 years. So the amyloid deposits came after the cognitive deficits. That's the point. And here, this is just to put a little bit of a finer point on it. These findings suggest that amyloid accumulation may not necessarily come first in Alzheimer's disease process. Prior work used memory tests that are too crude to compare subtle cognitive changes. This is a key. A key to the research is that the tests that you administer from a cognitive standpoint have to be fine-grained enough, sensitive enough to detect subtle changes early on. And they feel that, some of these researchers feel that if the tests were a little bit more accurate, the cognitive tests, that we would be able to see that the amyloid deposits don't always come first. And here they say, the current study suggests that sensitive neuropsychological measures may be used to identify subtle cognitive difficulties and inefficiencies earlier in the disease process than previously thought possible, while amyloid is still accumulating at a more rapid rate and the neurodegenerative changes are just beginning. So this casts some doubt, these findings cast some doubt on the direction. Is it amyloid first and then cognitive decline? Well, again, these researchers have supposed and have discovered that there is a group of people that display subtle cognitive deficits even when their amyloid deposits are considered to be normal. Now, that still raises questions. Again, this is very difficult because the questions are the tests accurate, the cognitive tests? And secondly, does any amount of amyloid deposit tend to produce some kind of cognitive deficit? And the third question is, even if the answers to those suggest that amyloid may not be the direct cause, can it sometimes be the direct cause? Are there certain variations maybe of Alzheimer's or dementia or some other cognitive decline that do result from amyloid deposits? So a lot of questions, but the upshot of this research and these articles is that the direction is somewhat open to dispute. Does the amyloid precede cognitive decline or not? And we just don't know. So if you found something of use in this video, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell to be alerted to new content as it becomes available. I thank you so much for joining me today, and I look forward to seeing you again in another video. Thank you.